Mount Teide, the volcano that towers over Tenerife and Spain's Canary Islands, has been showing a long, slow buildup of unrest for close to a decade now. And in recent months, that unrest has picked up in a way that has scientists paying closer attention and residents asking harder co. Escalates. This is not a story about an eruption that is happening right now. It is a story about a volcano that has been quietly building pressure since 2016, with that pressure accelerating noticeably since 2022, and a summer of 2026 that has brought some of the most intense seismic swarms this island has recorded in years. Let's start with what Teide actually is. At 3,618 meters, it is Spain's highest peak, and by some measures, the third largest volcano on Earth when measured from its base on the ocean floor. It sits inside Las Cañadas, a massive caldera formed by repeated cycles of eruption and collapse over hundreds of thousands of years. Teide and its neighboring cone, Pico Viejo, were built up within that caldera through that long history of activity. The volcano last erupted in 1909 from the El Chiñero vent along the Santiago Ridge. Tenerife's broader volcanic history goes back further still, with the earliest documented eruption on the island, the Boca Cangrejo event, taking place in 1492, the same year Christopher Columbus's ships crossed the Atlantic. Historical accounts suggest his crew may have actually seen that eruption from the water as they passed. So this is a volcano with a long memory and a long record of activity, and it is also one of the most closely monitored volcanoes in the world. Two main agencies track it around the clock: the Instituto Geográfico Nacional, Spain's National Geographic Institute, known as the IGN, and the EIS, Instituto Volcanológico de Canarias, the Regional Volcanology Institute known as InVolcan. Together, they run a dense network of seismic stations, GPS ground deformation sensors, and gas monitoring equipment across the island, and their monitoring is what is picked up on everything that follows. The story of the current unrest really begins in October of 2016, when the first in a long series of seismic swarms was recorded beneath the western sector of Las Cañadas. A swarm in volcanology is a cluster of many small earthquakes happening in a short window of time, as opposed to a single large earthquake with aftershocks. Since that first swarm in 2016, similar episodes have recurred periodically in June of 2019, twice in the summer of 2022, again in November of 2024, and then increasingly often through 2025 and into 2026. By the time InVolcan recorded a swarm on July 3rd of this year, it was officially logged as the 14th hybrid event swarm detected beneath Tenerife since that first one back in 2016. What has changed is not that these swarms are happening, it is how often they are happening and how large some of them have gotten. Early episodes involved a few hundred small earthquakes over the course of a day or two. In February of 2026 alone, InVolcan and the IGN documented multiple separate swarms within the same month, on the 12th, the 16th and 17th, the 18th through the 20th, the 22nd, the 23rd and 24th, and the 25th and 26th, one running almost directly into the next. One of those episodes, beginning on the night of February 18th, produced roughly 950 individual seismic events by the time InVolcan filed its report the next day. Another swarm recorded that same month reportedly logged over 1,400 small earthquakes within a 14-hour window, according to regional reporting, out of the Canary Islands. That is a remarkable concentration of seismic energy for a system that, as recently as 2019, was only producing isolated swarms every few years. The pace did not let up as the year went on. Starting on June 18th, 2026, the Canary Islands seismic network picked up a fresh round of elevated activity, with more than 200 low-magnitude volcano-tectonic micro-earthquakes recorded in a single 48-hour stretch, centered roughly 10 kilometers beneath them. The southwestern sector of the caldera. The strongest event in that batch reached magnitude 1.1, still far too small to be felt by anyone on the surface, but notable simply for how many were packed into such a short window. By July 3rd, the 14th hybrid swarm of the ongoing sequence arrived, running for roughly 4.5 hours that evening. Alongside the earthquake swarms, two other signals have been building. The first is ground deformation, meaning the physical surface of the island slowly rising or shifting as pressure builds beneath it. Scientists have tracked a gradual uplift in the northeastern sector of the Teide Pico Viejo complex going back to 2014, and by early 2025, that cumulative rise measured around 1 centimeter across several GPS stations, which researchers described at the time as close to the maximum the current system had shown since monitoring began. More recent satellite radar measurements have pointed to a more substantial shift in a specific area of the volcanic complex. X, with a median line of sight displacement of roughly 6 centimeters, measured between early and mid-June of 2026 alone, a notably larger and faster change than the slow, multi-year creep recorded in prior years. The second signal is gas. Teide has shown a long-term increase in diffuse carbon dioxide emissions from its summit crater, tracked since 2016 alongside the seismic data. Scientists view rising CO2 output together with seismicity and ground deformation as the three main lines of evidence they use to judge whether magma is actively moving toward the surface, or whether what they are seeing is something else entirely. And that something else is the leading explanation both agencies have offered throughout this entire multi-year sequence. Their shared working hypothesis is that these swarms are being driven by the injection of magmatic fluids, hot gases, and liquids released from magma sitting at depth into Tenerife's hydrothermal system, rather than by magma itself physically forcing its way upward. In plainer terms, the picture scientists are describing as pressure and heat moving through cracks and fractures deep underground, agitating the rock and setting off small quakes, without that necessarily meaning molten rock is on the move toward an eruption. This same explanation has been repeated consistently by Volcano across nearly every report issued since 2016, including through the accelerated activity of 2025 and 2026. That consistency matters, because it is the basis for the official risk assessment that has accompanied every one of these swarms. Throughout this entire multi-year sequence, Tenerife's volcanic alert level has remained at the lowest tier on the 4-level scale used by Spanish and Canary Islands authorities, green, meaning early warning with no elevated eruption. Risk identified. Some reporting periods reference the island sitting at yellow, the second tier, tied to specific short monitoring windows, but the overwhelming and consistent message from both IGN and Volcano through 2025 and into mid-2026 has been that there is no indication of an increased likelihood of an eruption in the short or medium term, and that raising the alert level has not been considered necessary. Officials have laid out fairly specific criteria for when that assessment would change. Experts have said that for the situation to become genuinely concerning, they would need to see earthquakes of a meaningfully larger magnitude, in the range of 2.5 or higher, strong enough to actually be felt by people on the ground and quizás concentrated closely in both time and location, rather than diffuse and low energy the way current swarms have been. On top of that, they would want to see a rapid and sustained acceleration in ground deformation, well beyond the gradual centimeter scale shifts recorded so far, along with a marked, unambiguous change in the volume or chemical composition of gases being released. As of the most recent monitoring reports, none of those thresholds have been met. Nearly all recorded earthquakes in this sequence have stayed below magnitude 1, SOME below even 0.7, and officials have repeatedly noted that essentially none of them have been felt by residents at all. Most are only detectable through automated seismic instruments, not by anyone standing on the ground above them, producing thicker, slower-moving magma that takes longer to migrate, which lowers the overall probability of a fast-developing eruption scenario, even if pressure continues building. At the same time, he has been careful not to rule anything out entirely, noting that precursor activity ahead of an eventual eruption could unfold over a couple of years, or, just as plausibly, stretch out over 50. Nemesio Perez, who directs Volcano, has offered a similar assessment, describing the accumulated changes recorded since 2016, rising CO2, subtle deformation, and persistent background seismicity, as genuinely significant shifts worth tracking closely, while also stress. Seeing that none of it, on its own or combined, currently points toward an eruption being imminent. Regional officials have echoed that same balance. Manuel Miranda, the Canary Islands regional counselor overseeing territorial policy, has urged calm and caution among residents, following periods of heavier seismic activity, while Rosa Davila, president of the Tenerife Cabildo, the island's governing council, has stated publicly that the island is more prepared than it has ever been for any volcanic scenario that might eventually develop. That preparation has become a visible part of this story in its own right. As the underlying seismic and geochemical signals have accumulated over multiple years without resolving one way or the other, island and national authorities have begun taking practical steps to be ready regardless of how this eventually plays out. The IGN has moved to install inclinometers, precision instruments buried 20 to 30 meters underground, designed to measure subtle tilting of the ground with far greater precision than surface GPS alone can provide. IGN and Volcano have also said they intend to deepen their collaboration, pooling data streams and upgrading shared monitoring infrastructure across the island. On the civil preparedness side, the Tenerife Cabildo has floated the idea of running public emergency drills specifically built around a volcanic scenario, aimed at raising general public awareness and readiness well before any actual crisis point is reached, rather than scrambling to organize a response only after the alert level changes. It is worth being clear about what has and has not driven public concern through this whole stretch. Local and regional outlets covering the Canary Islands have documented real public unease at points along the way, particularly following the largest individual swarms, the kind involving many hundreds or over 1,000 SME, all quakes packed into a single day. Some of that unease has been amplified by online commentary and independent monitoring channels, speculating more dramatically about an approaching eruption than the official agencies themselves have. But the felt experience on the ground has remained limited because the overwhelming majority of these earthquakes sit below magnitude 1, and often well below that. Essentially, none of them have actually been felt by people living on the island. The seismic story here has almost entirely played out inside monitoring stations and data logs, not in shaking ground or rattled windows. Teide National Park, the UNESCO World Heritage Site surrounding the peak, has remained open to visitors throughout this entire period, and officials have repeatedly stated there is no operational restriction or safety concern affecting travel to the island or the mountain itself. There have been a few notable exceptions worth flagging for context. In late February of 2026, a magnitude 4 earthquake did rattle parts of the island strongly enough to be noticed by tourists and residents alike. Significantly, though, that particular quake was traced not to Teide itself, but to Medio, a separate, smaller volcanic structure nearby. A reminder that Tenerife's overall seismic picture involves more than one active source, and that not every notable tremor on the island is automatically a Teide signal. So where does that leave the actual risk picture heading forward? The honest, evidence-based answer scientists themselves have been giving is one of genuine uncertainty rather than confident reassurance in either direction. On one hand, nothing in the current data, not the earthquake magnitudes, not the deformation rates, not the gas emissions, meets the specific thresholds officials have laid out as markers of a rising, near-term eruption risk. On the other hand, the overall trend line since 2016, and especially since 2022, has clearly been one of increasing frequency, and in the case of that June 2026 deformation measure, increasing magnitude of underlying signals, not a pattern that is fading out or stabilizing. Scientists describe this as a system worth taking seriously and continuing to watch closely, precisely because it has been persistently active for the better part of a decade without either dying down or crossing into more acute warning territory. That combination, sustained unrest without either resolution or acceleration into clear crisis, is part of why this story keeps resurfacing every few months rather than settling into the background. Each new swarm generates a fresh round of headlines and local concern. Agencies issue updated reports confirming the activity. For residents, and for anyone with plans to visit the island, the practical takeaway from everything monitored so far is straightforward. There is no current operational restriction on Tenerife or Teide National Park, no elevated alert level in place, and no official guidance suggesting people should alter travel or daily life because of this activity. At the same time, authorities are treating the broader pattern seriously enough to invest in new monitoring hardware, deepen coordination between agencies, and start laying groundwork for public emergency preparedness, a set of actions that reflects genuine scientific attentiveness to a slow-building situation rather than either alarm or dismissal. The situation is being watched closely, specifically because it has neither faded away nor crossed into clear crisis, and until one of those two things happens, that is likely to remain the state of affairs. A volcano that has been quietly signaling something for the better part of a decade, monitored around the clock by two of the world's most experienced volcanic observatories, with no one, including the scientists closest to the data, yet able to say for certain where this ultimately leads. It helps to put Teide in the context of the wider Canary Islands volcanic chain, because this archipelago is genuinely one of the more active volcanic regions in Europe, even though eruptions on any single island remain rare on a human timescale. The islands sit above a hotspot in the Atlantic seafloor, similar in concept to the mechanism that built the Hawaiian island chain, and each island in the Canaries has gone through its own cycle of shield-building eruptions, followed by long periods of relative quiet, sometimes followed by a later stage of renewed, more localized volcanism. Tenerife and its neighbor Gran Canaria are generally described by geologists as sitting in that later, rejuvenated stage, having gone through an early shield-building phase, then a long dormant stretch geologists sometimes call the Gomera stage, before volcanic activity resumed roughly 4 million years ago and built the Las Cañadas complex that now houses Teide and Pico Viejo. What made La Palma's 2021 eruption so instructive from a monitoring standpoint was how clearly its warning signs presented themselves in the run-up to the actual eruption. Ground deformation there accelerated sharply, and rapidly in the final days beforehand, with the surface rising roughly 30 centimeters in just the week before magma finally broke through, and seismic activity intensified into dense, closely packed swarms of progressively stronger earthquakes as magma pushed toward the surface. That rapid, unmistakable acceleration is precisely the kind of signal scientists say they have not seen at Teide. Magma, beneath La Palma's Cumbre Vieja ridge, is also known to move unpredictably once it does begin migrating. in that case, shifting laterally several kilometers within a matter of days before erupting, which is part of why Dominguez has been careful to note that even with good monitoring, pinpointing an exact eruption location and timing in the Canaries can remain difficult right up until the final stretch. Teide's own magmatic system. It is also worth walking through in a bit more depth what the monitoring agencies are actually watching for and why each measurement matters. Seismic monitoring captures the earthquakes themselves, but scientists pay close attention not just to how many quakes occur, but to their depth, their waveform character, and how tightly clustered they are in time and space. The events recorded beneath Teide over the past several years have consistently shown what seismologists call hybrid or low-frequency waveforms, signal patterns typically associated with fluid movement, gas, and lie. Quid, shifting through cracked, fractured rock, rather than the sharper, higher-frequency signatures typically produced by rock breaking apart as magma physically forces its way upward. That waveform distinction is one of the main technical reasons scientists have consistently favored the hydrothermal fluid explanation over more alarming magma ascent explanation for this entire multi-year sequence. Ground deformation monitoring, meanwhile, relies on a combination of GPS stations fixed at various points around the volcanic complex and satellite radar measurements capable of detecting extremely small shifts in the Earth's surface over time, sometimes down to fractions of a centimeter. Because volcanic systems can inflate and deflate for reasons connected to hydrothermal pressure changes as well as magma movement, deformation data is generally interpreted alongside seismic and gas data rather than in isolation. The uptick in localized deformation measured via satellite in June of 2026 is one of the more significant recent data points precisely because it moved faster and covered more ground than the slower, multi-year, centimeter-scale creep recorded in prior years, even though officials have stopped short of calling it a decisive turning point on its own. Gas monitoring rounds out the picture by tracking the volume and chemical makeup of gases venting from Teide's summit crater and surrounding fumaroles, primarily carbon dioxide, but also other volcanic gases, whose ratios can shift meaningfully as magma at depth to gases, or as the composition of material at depth in jez. A steady, gradual rise in background CO2 emissions has been part of the story since 2016, but scientists have said that what would concern them far more is a sudden, sharp spike or an abrupt shift in gas chemistry, signals that have not been observed to date. There's also a broader economic and civic dimension to this story worth understanding, since Tenerife is not just a scientifically significant volcanic system. It is also one of the most visited islands in Spain, drawing millions of tourists. Every year, many of whom come specifically to hike, ski, or sightsee around Teide National Park itself. That dual identity, a place that is simultaneously a major tourist economy and an actively monitored volcanic hazard zone, shapes how officials communicate about ongoing unrest. Public statements from regional leaders V consistently tried to strike a careful balance, acknowledging that the volcano is genuinely active and worth monitoring, while stressing that current conditions pose no threat to residents or visitors, precisely because overstating the risk carries its own real consequences for an economy so dependent on tourism, while understating it would carry far graver consequences if conditions were ever to change quickly. Taken together, the picture that emerges from nearly a decade of continuous monitoring is one of a volcano that is unmistakably alive and active beneath the surface, showing a slow but real accumulation of pressure-related signals, without yet showing the kind of sharp, converging acceleration across seismicity, deformation, and gas chemistry that has historically preceded actual eruptions elsewhere in the Canary Islands. Whether the current uptick in swarm frequency and the localized June 2026 deformation signal mark the early stages of a longer path toward eventual eruption, or simply another chapter in a hydrothermal system that has been venting pressure on an off since 2016 without ever crossing into eruptive territory, is a question that, by the scientific community's own admission, cannot yet be answered with confidence. What can be said is that Tenerife is better instrumented and better prepared to detect that transition whenever and if it eventually comes than it has ever been before, and that the agencies watching this volcano around the clock are treating every new swarm, every fresh centimeter of ground movement, and every shift in gas output as one more data point in a story that is still very much being written.